Hello and welcome. You're tuned in to the best in paranormal talk radio. This is Darkness Radio. I'm your host, Dave Schrader, along with me, the one and only Mr. Timmy D. Hey, Tim.
Hey there.
Listen, I've got an interesting guest coming up today. And I got to tell you, I appreciate when creators and entertainers can come up with interesting ways to make history fun. And earlier this year, at the beginning of this COVID nonsense, well, not this year, but it feels like they've just bled into one giant year of COVID. But when COVID started, my daughter kept begging me to watch the musical Hamilton.
Yeah.
And I'm like, boy, I love history, but I don't know that I want to watch a musical about history. So I turned it on and loved it. And, fascinating, well done show. Great musical numbers, everything. But I loved how my daughters connected with these historical characters and understood that some of this was written for drama, but that these were based on real people at real events in history and how those events shaped our world. So I love when kids can learn things and when anybody can learn things through a different perspective. And I got a note sent to me from one of the publicists we work with. And I'm like, oh, gosh, this hits every possible button we could be interested in. The book is called Edgar Cayce and the Unfulfilled Destiny of Thomas Jefferson Reborn. So we've got Edgar Cayce, reincarnation, Thomas Jefferson. Who could ask for more? This is awesome. So I jumped on. I said, "Yeah, let's do this. How can we get this together?" And luckily, the author of the book, Joanne DiMaggio, was available today to sit down with us and talk. Joanne DiMaggio is a respected expert in the field of reincarnation and soul writing, which she describes as a written form of meditation. She's been actively involved with Edgar Cayce's Association for Research and Enlightenment since 1987 and has been the coordinator for the Charlottesville, Virginia team since August 2008. She's here with us now to discuss this new book. Thank you so much for being here, Joanne.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Reincarnation fascinates me. We have had experiences on the show talking to people that believed to be reincarnated, and we have spoken to people, at live events that we've done, and I'm always fascinated as to why people believe they're reincarnated and what triggers that feeling for them. And I'd like to start a little bit about that with you. Do you believe everybody's been reincarnated, or are there new souls that are injected into the world all the time?
No, I believe we were all reincarnated. We were all created at the same time. And the difference between us, I think, you hear that expression, oh, he or she's an old soul. There's no such thing as an old soul because we were all created at the same time. The difference is some of us, like I say, old souls are slow learners. We just have to keep coming back over and over again because we didn't pass the lesson that we signed up for on this earth that I think of as a school. And so that's why some of us have been here more often than others, but we've still all come into existence at the same time.
And when people are feeling drawn to specific locations or eras, I am on a TV show called The Holzer Files, and we did this episode a few weeks back called Forever Home. And Chris Emery, our guest on that, feels tied to that home. He dreams about that home. He lived there when he was a child, but he's been gone for 30 plus years. But he dreams about that home. He feels a pull to that and even wants his remains scattered on the property once he passes. Do you think that has a tie to a past life? Or could it just be that a past life was similar to something like that in that home that resonates with him? And how do we draw that divination line to know which side of that his story would come down on?
Well, it's unusual for a soul to be reincarnated in the same biological family that they were in before. So if that house was the house he lived in as a child, that's a whole different set of circumstances. It could be that the house is reminiscent of a previous home that he lived in. We're all given memory triggers. These are like right before we come into existence in our life between life session. We're given memory triggers that when they come up, they remind us of a previous lifetime. And so when you see something like something you had in a previous life, or you hear, like you'll hear music, you'll read something, you'll see a movie. For me, I was always attached to the 18th century American history. And I was born and raised in Chicago. That never felt like home to me. And I had a professor tell me, he said, you have the most uncanny feel for the 18th century of any student I've ever had. And I thought, that's true, but I didn't put two and two together to think that it might be a past life bleed through. So, but when I came to Virginia to, trace all those historic places on the Eastern Seaboard that I had this affinity for, when I came to Virginia, it was like my soul took this collective sigh of relief, like, oh, I'm finally home. And it took me 25 years, but I eventually moved here. And it's been wonderful ever since. So those memories are embedded in our souls, and they come up at the most unexpected times. And it could be, like I said, you might take a vacation to the same place year after year after year because you can't get enough of it. Or it could be a scent that might trigger a memory, or any number of ways that deja vu experiences come up in your life. Those are all memory triggers from previous lifetimes.
How did your journey into the study of reincarnation begin?
Well, I was born and raised Catholic, went to 12 years of Catholic school. And in that time, things just didn't make any sense to me. The whole concept of sin, you only get this one chance and you die and you go to hell, I felt like that couldn't be what a loving and just God would do to his creation. So I started looking for answers elsewhere. And as a teenager, I was reading books about Edgar Cayce. I read the first reincarnation book I read was A Search for Bridie Murphy. And that got me interested in it because suddenly everything started to make sense. So anyway, I was just sort of surface interest in it until 1987, when Shirley MacLaine's Out on a Limb became a miniseries. And they ran it in January of 87 on ABC. I'll never forget that, because that was my big wake-up call. And I think it was the big wake-up call of a lot of sleeping metaphysicians. And Shirley talked a lot about her reincarnation experiences. That triggered my original interest in it. And that, plus some hints I had gotten from childhood about this 18th century life, I decided I would look into it. I joined Edgar Cayce's Association for Research and Enlightenment and started my own past life research organization outside of Chicago, and have been doing this work ever since.
All right. Well, let me ask you in one perspective for the skeptics out there, not the cynics, just so you understand the differentiating line for us. Cynics, there's nothing we're going to do to ever convince them of this opportunity. Skeptics just have healthy questions and concerns about just blindly believing. For people that are still on the fence or skeptical regarding the concept of reincarnation, and especially when it comes to specific people, like you felt pulled to the 18th century. I have a friend who obsessed when we were children. He obsessed with the Revolutionary War. Mm-hmm. For a kid, that just seemed really weird to me. Even as a kid, I was like, why are you so enthralled with this? And he would paint miniatures and he could tell you details about the uniforms and things that I thought, how does he know all this? And then I would ask other people to see if he was right. And he knew his stuff. And, for a 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old kid, that was weird to me. So as an adult, I often wondered, was he reincarnated? Was that his era? Or is it because of his fascination with history and detail to painting and his artistry that a creative imagination could fabricate this belief that there was a past life as somebody from that era? How do we know how to separate those two concepts? Well,
that's something that each of us individually would come to understand, because it's our experience. You really sometimes when I even talk about reincarnation, I look at people like, are they thinking I have two heads or what? Right. And I have to, to be honest with you, I don't really talk about this to my mainstream family or friends because they just don't get it. They're not interested. They don't want to hear about it. A lot of people have a religious bias against reincarnation. They feel like this is going against, the dogma of their particular religious sect. Although then I tell them my little story about how reincarnation was in the Bible until the Council of Nicaea, and then it was taken out. But that's a whole subject unto itself, I'm sure. You get clues all through your life that you had another lifetime, but most people don't pay attention to that. Whereas others really zero in on it like I have and your friend has, because it suddenly makes sense. You resonate to certain foods, certain cultures, certain architecture, certain costumes, certain music, and you don't know why. And also you are repulsed by certain culture, certain music, certain architecture. You don't want anything to do with it. And you have to wonder why, because you didn't learn that as a child. That wasn't part of your upbringing. Where did this come from? So this is what leads people to look into reincarnation. And you don't have to believe in it for it to be present in your life. And I haven't had anybody that's had a regression who then says to me, I think I made that whole thing up. They go into it thinking they might be making it up. Like, is this going to be my imagination? I assure them it isn't, but I let them have the experience themselves. Especially those that feel deep emotion when they're recalling something. Could be a trauma that happened to them, or a loss of some sort, or an illness. This isn't something they're going to be making up. And what I love to do in my research project, when I publish my books based on a research project, I always list the professions that my researchers represent, because these are all people that are in very respected professional backgrounds. They're not the kind that you'd look at and go, oh, he or she is inclined toward making things up. So across the board, regardless of their age and their background, they have this similar experience in going to a previous life that's actually impacting them in the here and now. We do narrow it down so that past life is the one that comes through, because you can't work on all of them in one individual lifetime. So we do narrow it down, and it becomes a healing modality. Once they see the origin of the issues that they're dealing with now, they get these aha moments. Suddenly everything makes sense. And in and of itself, that's a healing. So it's extremely valuable and powerful as a healing modality.
Well, talk to us now, if you would, to introduce listeners, newer listeners that we're picking up all the time. What is Edgar Cayce's story? Can you talk to us a little bit about Edgar Cayce to introduce him to our audience that way?
Sure. Well, Edgar Cayce is considered the most renowned psychic of the 20th century. And you can read a short bio of him on edgarcayce.org. That's the ARE website. And he is also considered the father of holistic medicine. At first, he was just doing health readings. He would go in, people would ask him questions. He'd go into a trance, go to his source, get the answer, bring it back. Of the 14,000 readings he did in his lifetime, 12,000 of those are health readings. And the reason he's called the father of holistic medicine is because his remedies were way ahead of their time, and they're still being used today. Then he started someone asked him a question, and he got an answer that had to do with past lives. And this threw Mr. Cayce off for a bit because, he was a very devout Christian. He read the Bible once a year for every year of his life. He taught Sunday school. So when this started coming out, it was a shock to him. And for a few weeks, he actually stopped doing readings because he was concerned about, what is this? Where is this coming from? But then, he realized that it was for the good of the people that he was doing the readings for. And he started to do what they called life readings. And that's what he did for TJ. when he was 2 days old. And that's the whole basis of my new book.
And Edgar Cayce, I mean, he certainly was a remarkable man, had some just, I know we've talked about him through the years on the shows, folks, so you can go back into the archives and dig through. And that reminds me, Tim, I want to make a quick mention. You said that there is going to be season, 3 or 4? We're going to start dropping some of those episodes probably early next week.
Yeah, early next week. Yeah.
Okay. Was it season 3 or 4?
Season 3.
Okay. So just to cue everybody in, you can go back in and hear season 1 and 2 right now in its entirety of what we've been able to recapture of Darkness Radio. Season 3 will start next week on the deal. So you get to go back 15 years into our archives. But we've talked about Edgar Cayce, and it's a fascinating story. Now, introducing TJ, talk to me about this story, because this, again, being the basis for the book, and we do have a link up for that book in today's program guide, Edgar Cayce and the Unfulfilled Destiny of Thomas Jefferson Reborn. So take me back, what is it, June of 1936, right?
Right. He was born in June 1936. He is the nephew of Gladys Davis, who was Cayce's lifelong secretary and archivist. And TJ is part of the soul family to which Edgar and Gladys and many others belong. He's been with Cayce many, many lifetimes, he says. And he wanted to be with him in this lifetime. But by the time he says he looked in on him, Mr. Cayce was too old. He wasn't having children. And then TJ thought, well, then I'll come in through my Aunt Gladys, but she wasn't married or having children. So then he thought, okay, I'll come in through Gladys's brother, Boyd Davis, and his wife, Berlin. They won't want to keep me because they have alcohol and gambling problems. The last thing they're going to want is a baby. So I'll end up with my Aunt Gladys, and then from Gladys, I'll end up with Mr. Cayce. So actually, it was pretty ingenious thinking on the part of the soul about how to get to Mr. Cayce. But when he was born, because he had been sort of sloshing around in a womb of alcohol for 9 months, when he came out, he said he was like a piece of wood. He was all dry. His body was all dried up, and the doctor told his parents, he's not going to live. In 3 days, you're going to have to plan a funeral. And then Mr. Cayce, of course, knowing this, told Gladys, see if his parents will let you bring him to me. She asked them, and they were glad for her to take the baby. And she took the baby, 2 days old, to the Cayce house. Mr. Cayce did a reading, quick health reading, said, give him carnation milk and he'll be fine. They gave him carnation milk, and he was fine. And then Cayce gave a life reading for TJ. And in that life reading is when it came up about Cayce named 4 past lives that TJ had. One was in Atlantis. One was in the beginning of France when they were planning a government. And then the 2 that are famous, Alexander the Great and then Thomas Jefferson. And in the course of that reading, Cayce said that TJ would be able to do for the world what his soul did as Jefferson for this country. So imagine having that as your prophecy about you when you're only 2 days old. And so I had found out about TJ and his reading when I first joined the ARE in 1987. And I tried to, I think of myself as a reporter for the universe. I love a good story. And when I hear a story and I think somebody, has been maligned in some way, or that the truth isn't out quite about their story, I feel compelled to get in there and dig and find the truth and then share that with the rest of the world. So this was the case with TJ Davis. And by the way, Edgar Cayce is the one who named him. TJ stands for Thomas Jefferson Davis. So I tried to get in touch with him. Nobody at the ARE would connect us. And so this was in 1987. I moved to Charlottesville, Virginia in 1995, unaware that he had moved to Charlottesville from Virginia Beach a year or two earlier. And then in 1996, we were connected by a mutual friend, and the rest, as they say, is history.
All right. Well, take me back, if you would, to this reading. Explain to people what you mean by a reading. He's going to do this health reading for TJ at a very early age, but then starts picking up on these past lives.
Mm-hmm.
How does that work? What would Mr. Cayce do to tap into that aspect?
Well, Mr. Cayce would go into a trance, and then he would access TJ's, he either accesses Akashic record, which is the universe's supercomputer that has every thought, word, and deed that we souls have ever had. So you can look up your past life information in the Akashic records. Think of it as a super library in the sky, and you've got a book with your soul's name on it, and you can pull the book and read. Or Cayce went directly to source for the information. And so he would go in a trance, and then he usually would wait for a question, and then he would answer it. But sometime in the very beginning of the reading, he would, share information about this particular soul. And so during the course, of the reading, the first reading he gave, he would tell the parents or anybody else that was sitting there at the reading about the child, and about the characteristics of that particular soul. And then often he would say, well, this is from, he's got this characteristic, which is similar to the one that he had in the X lifetime. And so he would give the lifetimes. He would give very little information about them, and then move on to maybe give some guidance about, if it's a child, to give some guidance about how the parents can raise that child for the soul's optimal growth. If it's a health reading, he would give the remedy and say what they needed to take, or change their diet or something like that. And then when questions were asked, he'd answer them, and then he would say, we are through for the moment, and then that would be the end of the reading. And Mr. Cayce did not know while he was in trance what he was saying. So he had to either know what it was based on what he would read from Gladys's transcripts,
right,
or somebody had to tell him. So this was the only life reading that TJ got. The rest of the readings he got until Mr. Cayce died, when TJ was like 8.5 years old, were all health readings for him, because he had a slew of health issues as a child that his parents were constantly going to Mr. Cayce to get readings about. So that's how that worked.
Now, he sees this child not just as Thomas Jefferson, but having lived a life as Alexander the Great as well.
Right. Yeah. But he didn't put much emphasis on that life. He didn't seem to tie it in at all to anything that TJ was going to be having to work on in this current life. It was,
okay.
He just made that statement that, that he could do for the world what Jefferson did for this country.
Right.
And that became the problematic issue of TJ's entire life. Believe me, it caused a lot of hardship for him. So that's what I was curious about when I wanted to write a book about him. I thought, what happens to you when you're told you had this great past life? How does that set you up, for your current life? How do you live up to that?
Yeah, that's tough. When you're living under any kind of shadow of expectation is tough. But when you suddenly have this dropped on you that you're going to be, this power, this important being to American history, I can't even imagine what that must be like.
It's not easy.
No,
not at all. Not at all, because Mr. Cayce, gave very specific instructions to TJ's parents about how to raise him in order for him to be able to have the tools that he needed to fulfill this prophecy. They didn't do anything that he said to do.
Oh.
And, I have a section in the book, I call it educational hodgepodge, because he had very specific instructions on the type of schooling that TJ needed, and they ignored it. And so at that point, you can see that his soul was going to go down a completely different path than what Mr. Cayce had foreseen, because we have, the soul's free will involved in these decisions. So at any given time, you could be, someone could do a reading on you and say, oh, you're going to be president of the United States. Well, if you decide I hate politics and I'm never going to run for office, you won't fulfill that prophecy. It doesn't mean it couldn't have been true. It just means that you took a different route to in this lifetime. So that's basically what happened to him.
But if he feels Edgar Cayce, who was eerily accurate with his detailed information, if he felt that this was the child's destiny and even gave the roadmap for it, doesn't that starts to get into some weird aspects of the metaphysical? Because if that was what he saw outlaid, I know it's just one potential outcome, but why would that information be given to him at all if the sole contract that TJ created before here was not to come back like that or was going to buck the system?
Well, I have a theory about what happened here, and I didn't even come up with it until the book was finished. I don't think that Mr. Cayce's prediction had anything to do with Thomas Jefferson. I believe that his prediction had to do with the Edgar Cayce readings and teachings, and that I think what he meant, because, throughout his life, in our friendship, TJ has said to me, I really think that all the answers that mankind needs are contained in those readings, if only they would take the time to read them. So TJ was taught by Mr. Cayce. He was personally mentored by Mr. Cayce from the time he was very, very young. 2 years old, he's out on the pier fishing with Edgar Cayce. And while he's out there, Edgar Cayce's teaching him how to read auras, all about reincarnation, all about the creation story, all about karma,
right,
and all this. And he's pouring all this information into the vessel of this little boy. Because I really feel like he felt that someday he was going to spread that word out to the rest of the world. And so it wasn't necessarily like this is a political global initiative that we're planning here. This is that the fact that he was Thomas Jefferson, what that really meant was people are going to sit up and pay attention to this soul. If they in fact believe that he was Thomas Jefferson. Oh, Thomas Jefferson has a message for us in the 20th century, 21st century. What is it? They think of him as a great sage, a man of great wisdom, and they would sit up and pay attention. And then, TJ would then share with them what he learned from Mr. Cayce. And that in and of itself could have a global impact if everyone believed in reincarnation, if everyone understood the way the universe operates, the way Cayce shared it. Our perspectives would be completely different than they are now. And I think that that's where the power was. And I think that's where the misunderstanding came into. So Mr. Cayce was supposed to give TJ a second life reading when TJ was 13. Of course, he passed before, Mr. Cayce passed before then. And TJ never got that second reading. And he feels like if he had gotten it, it might have been the roadmap for him on what he was supposed to do next. So after Cayce died, he really just floundered and became very much of a hippie kind of recluse guy. And for that reason, he got a very, very negative reputation at the ARE. And so it wasn't until a few years ago when I invited him to start telling his story that all of this has started to come out.
All right. If I could take you back a little bit, we talked about pre-birth, how the soul was manipulating the Rubik's Cube of life exchange, right, in order to find his way to Edgar Cayce.
Right.
If that ethereal plane exists at that informational byway that we're choosing our lives and how to manipulate things to get us to where we're going to be, why wouldn't TJ have been given the information that, obviously you saw this was not the route. Edgar's not going to have any more children. Gladys not going to have any more children, but we can come in through this angle. Why wouldn't the information be given to TJ at that point? But at this point, if you're born now, you're never going to fulfill your goal with Edgar because he'll be dead long before you're able to get that second reading, before you'll get put on the correct path. It seems like that's an important issue in this whole manual of success that, he chose to be born this way.
Right. But, we have free will. That's the kicker in all of this. And nothing is predestined that it's going to be exactly like this. This is like, we're setting up the socioeconomic conditions for you to come in. You're going to pick these parents. And when you pick these parents, you're going to know that they're alcoholics and they're gamblers. And that's going to set up a problem. And, you're going to end up with Mr. Cayce because of that. And with Gladys because of that. At any given time, he could have, and this is where I don't sugarcoat this book. At any given time, I know he was only 8.5 when Mr. Cayce died, and there wasn't much he could do at that age in terms of his future. But he said that at that point forward, nobody at the ARE or in that circle did anything to nurture him, did anything to teach him anything, did not give him a place to be a part of that scene. His Aunt Gladys was frantically trying to save the readings. So his parents were still not able to be parents to him. He was thrown from pillar to post, stay with the grandmother, stay with an aunt and uncle, then finally staying with complete strangers. He didn't have that essential upbringing that Mr. Cayce talked about. Now, did he know at the time that when he came into existence that Mr. Cayce was going to die in 1945? I don't think so. So there was no way of knowing. Now, what I say about TJ, and I've told him this, at some point, maybe when he turned 18, he could have made the decision, okay, I know what I have the potential to be. This is what I'm going to need to do. Now that I'm an adult, I'm going to make these decisions for myself. Nobody's going to hold me back. Nobody's going to tell me what I can or cannot do. And then he could have altered his life's trajectory. He chose not to do that. And so the life that he chose put him on a path that pushed him further and further and further away from the Cayce legacy, from the readings. And as a matter of fact, he said he didn't even really talk about any of this for many years until, he came out and started to do these small group conversations. So I don't, in a way, I don't blame him because he was a child at the time and he couldn't make any of those major decisions. But also, I feel like when he was an adult, he could have changed that trajectory, but he chose not to. So again, it's all about free will.
When Edgar Cayce is doing a reading for somebody and seeing their potential, is he seeing the potential with the kind of addendum in place that this is the potential I see for you while I'm alive? Meaning that since none of us know the day of our passing, he had no idea of knowing when his time would be. So when he was reading for TJ and knew that he was going to take this kid under his tutelage, did he see the path only as if his life would have completed and gone longer with TJ as a part of it? Do you know what I'm asking?
I know what you're asking, and that probably is the case. Like this is the way it is right now. And if we continue on this path, this is the way I see it's going to be played out. TJ said that right before Mr. Cayce died, he called him in and he said to him, look, things are not going to work out the way I thought they would. So he knew right then and there that their great work that they had planned on doing together wasn't going to come to fruition. But I think that whenever anybody does a reading, they do it at that moment, at that particular moment in time. This is the way it looks right now, but things could change. So,
does that make you question then the impact and the maybe better care should be taken with people that have a gift like Edgar Cayce? Because simply by stating this is the destiny I see for you, this is where I see you going, this is, I see that greatness is within you, and kind of leading the kid through that path, helping him to achieve as long as he could, but then at the end saying, yeah, boy, this is not going to work. That and I'm not beating up on Edgar Cayce on this. I want you to know, I just like, should there be a certain set of guidelines put in place of what you say? Because if you're setting this predetermined deal and this kid is 8 years old, seeing a destiny, learning from this master, and then the master says, yeah, oh boy, things aren't going to go the way we hoped they were. Does that set an intention for this child that might have taken him off course? Had Edgar said to him, our time together is coming to an end. Your destiny is still written. You are a man of greatness and you will be. Stay true to the path. Would that have maybe helped keep him there? And what is the responsibility of somebody who has this gift to try to, see these things through, as opposed to maybe accidentally monkey wrenching the entire story?
Well, I don't know, because, I wasn't privy to that conversation, and it happened Cayce was already on his deathbed when this conversation took place. And then TJ's relaying it from the memory of a 70-something-year-old man who's trying to remember something that was said to him when he was 8.5. So that could have been that, maybe when he said it wasn't going to work out like I thought, he could have been referring to the fact that he wasn't going to be able to give him that second reading. So I don't really know. I don't think TJ felt at the time that Cayce said that it was all over for him. I think he honestly felt that, well, somebody else here will take me under their wing. They'll let me, they'll teach me. There were so many people at the ARE, so many fabulous, wonderful, extraordinary people that were there on a constant basis. They'd come to see Mr. Cayce, then they'd end up staying. And so he had this extended family of people with extraordinary abilities and knowledge, and could very easily have stepped in and kept him in the circle. None of them did. So, he went from, he says, my life went from applause to yawn when Cayce died. So he said everybody was just scurrying around, not knowing what quite to do, because Edgar Cayce was the core. He was the center. Everything, happened around him. All the attention was on him, and suddenly he's gone. And what are you going to do? So I don't blame Mr. Cayce for. I think Mr. Cayce did everything he possibly could. And if you read some of the comments that Cayce made about TJ, you know how much he loved that boy. Just absolutely adored him, thought the world of him, and was really hopeful about what he would be able to do for the world. But, like I said, that just didn't quite turn out the way everybody had hoped it would.
Oh, boy. Well, what about this story intrigued you so much that you wanted to tell it, to kind of dig into this biography, especially with all of the people that Edgar Cayce came into contact with? Why this story particularly? Well,
because he's the only one. First of all, it combined my interest in reincarnation and history. So loving those two things, and being a writer by profession, I had been a journalist for quite a while. And I felt that TJ had gotten a bad rap. I felt that when I was trying to even get in touch with him, there were so many roadblocks thrown up where people told me, no, I don't think you should meet him. No, you'd regret it if you met him. And just lots of red flags that were being waved by people I actually respected. I felt like I was deliberately being kept apart from him. And it was so funny because I had a friend of mine knew a woman who was a channeler, and, this is back in the 80s. And so, and I said, well, I've never been to a channeling session. And I asked the question, am I ever going to meet this guy? And she said, nothing you can do will make it happen. And nothing you can do, if it's not meant to happen, nothing you can do will make it happen. If it is meant to happen, nothing you do will stop it from happening. So, when I moved to Virginia, and then found out that he was here as well, I wanted to tell his story because I just felt like he'd gotten a bad rap, that this wasn't fair, that people were judging him for not fulfilling this prophecy but there were extenuating circumstances that nobody was taking into consideration. So in a way, it was, me trying to correct an injustice, giving him validation, and setting the record straight, because he was seemingly powerless to do it himself. And so I just thought this is the most fascinating story. And then when I finally got permission many, many years later to work on the book, I had to get written permission from him so that I could go to the Edgar Cayce Foundation and go into the archives. And there was a file in there on him that was like 3 feet deep. I mean, there was tremendous amount of material in there, letters that had been written, his report cards were in there, the drawings he made were in there. It took me 8 years, I kid you not, of going back and forth, doing whatever research I could in Virginia Beach, then coming back and sandwiching in the talks that he gave. The person working at the Edgar Cayce Foundation at the time was Karen Davis, who is a member of the Davis family. So she was, she sort of took Gladys's role as the person who was safeguarding the reading. So she was very cautious about, the way that I was working with the reading, with the files. And because some of them were so old, there were things in the file that papers that, because back then they did everything on carbon paper, on onions,
right? Carbon
paper, on onions, and it was falling apart in my hands. And I said, we've got to do something to preserve this. And but that's again another story. But the wealth of information is there. And when TJ read the book, he said that it was remarkable because there were things in there he didn't even know about himself. And so pulling it all together, sandwiching everybody's comments together into some sort of cohesive storyline was a major project. And but I have to tell you, I'm so glad. I mean, I had obstacles thrown at me the whole time I was working, because there were people who did not want me to write this book. And I just persevered. I felt like I had made a promise to him in our Life Between Lives session that I would come in and do this story. And I always felt that Mr. Cayce and Gladys were with me. And there were times when I was frustrated and exhausted, and I put the book away, the manuscript away, wouldn't touch it for months, and then suddenly something would happen and I'd go back to it. So it's a miracle that it got done. And I wanted it finished before he left the planet. And so he's 84 years old now. And I was very, very grateful and humbled that I was able to hand him a copy of this book finished.
I bet it's got to be somewhat of a relief for him to know that, his story still had more to be told, and giving those insights into his world and what he had been through and what it was like to be in that situation. Why do you think people wrote him off so quickly? Why do you feel that, here was somebody that they respected, Edgar Cayce, he saw the potential, the importance of this boy. Why did no one, Obi-Wan Kenobi him and step in to try to help get him to the next level?
Well, I think there's probably a lot of reasons for that, and each person who chose not to do that had their own reason. He did develop a very unsavory reputation at ARE, and I think he became a source of embarrassment for them. And just because he became lost, without Mr. Cayce there, he didn't really know what to do with himself. Didn't know where he belonged. He couldn't get a job at ARE. He tried. He said, "I'll just let me work in the garden. Just let me be near the readings." And no. So whether there was an ego issue involved, whether there was a jealousy issue involved, an embarrassment issue, I don't really know, because I wasn't around back then in Virginia Beach, and a lot of the people who set up this negative framework around his reputation are gone now. Can't trace it back. But he, I think he did some things that were not favorable, and I think they held that against him. And because when I first tried to get in touch with him, and I wrote a letter to somebody at the ARE, I had a phone call from someone at ECF, and she said, if you want to come to Virginia Beach, I'll point him out to you, but I won't introduce you to him. And she said, made reference to the fact that he was like the son of a rock star. That was the kind of life that he was leading. And she said something, she made it sound like, if I met him, he would use me or blackmail me or try to get money out of me or something. She just said, things that really did put the fear of God in me. And I hesitated going forward because this is the kind of, response I was getting from people. And I thought, I'm going to just judge this on my own. I'm not going to let anybody color my opinion of him. And, I don't share that opinion now that I've known him all these years. He's got some issues that he's working on, but we all do. But I put this in the book in the introduction. If you're going to sit for one-on-one with anybody, sit with him, because conversations with him are extraordinary.
We need to take a quick break. Edgar Cayce and the Unfulfilled Destiny of Thomas Jefferson Reborn. Joanne DiMaggio, our guest, when we return to Darkness Radio. Welcome back to the program. Thank you for tuning in and being a part of our world. Let me remind you, folks, if you have got a giving heart and are interested in helping the Special Olympics, my son, Cliff Schrader, is doing the Polar Plunge to help raise awareness for Special Olympics. And all of the money goes to Special Olympians for their training, their uniforms, and for travel expenses. And I just want to clarify one thing, Tim, for the listeners. So many great listeners have already chipped in and helped out by making donations. I think people are misunderstanding saying that my son is a Special Olympian. He is not.
No.
Thankfully, he is just willing to do this every year. This is a part of his spirit. He donates time every year for children's special needs Y Camp experiences. He donates his time to do these polar plunges and raise awareness. It's just part of who he is, and I'm very proud of the work that he does. He's a firefighter here in the great state of Minnesota, in Minneapolis, and he, along with his other brothers in the fire department, do this polar plunge, and year after year, Cliff destroys everybody else with the amount of money he's able to raise. And this year, we're really hoping to hit, last year we hit $5,000. He put a lofty goal of $10,000, knowing the world is in a bit of a weird place, but understanding we've got a large reach of people across the world. And if everybody just donated $1, we'd well surpass the goal. So if you're interested in helping out and helping the Special Olympians, whether it's $1, $5, $10, $1 million, whatever you feel comfortable donating, email me, dave@darknessradio.com, and I'll send you the link to do that. Thank you to all of you who have done that already and reached in and given that precious $5, $10, $20 donation. A couple people throwing in $100. It means so much to his cause and really psychs my son up for the work that he does in helping to raise these much needed funds. So again, if you're interested in making a donation, just email me, dave@darknessradio.com. Let me remind you, tonight, live video stream on my Facebook page, Darkness Radio Facebook page, and the Darkness Radio YouTube page. Tonight, we're going to take a look back at last week's episode of the Holzer Files, Ancient Evil at Mystery Hill, America's Stonehenge. Tonight, my special guests, Scott Walter from America Unearthed, Alexandra Holzer, and Dennis Stone, the owner of Mystery Hill and America's Stonehenge, will be on with us tonight discussing that case, the strange situations that occurred there. We hope you'll tune in and check that out. For those of you that are podcast subscribers, you'll hear that episode in podcast form tomorrow, right here on the Best in Paranormal Talk Radio. We've got an interesting book, Edgar Cayce and the Unfulfilled Destiny of Thomas Jefferson Reborn. Again, folks, I can't stress enough how interesting it is to examine history through different lenses. And when you can look at books like this and it gives you that supernatural, paranormal tie to history and some of the people in history, man, what a great way to educate yourself and educate yourself on the metaphysical and what's going on. Our guest today, Joanne DiMaggio, and we're talking about this case. Talk to me about TJ's life after Edgar died. I know that we've touched on the base that really nobody kind of helped him after that. And he was on, but what type of things did he get involved in? What was his like? What was his life like, rather?
Well, he joined the Marines, and then after that, he just began to travel across Europe, and so he ended up starting in Greece and working his way across. His Aunt Gladys said that he had actually subconsciously followed Alexander the Great's path when he was conquering those countries. So,
wow.
Yeah, he ended up in Perugia, Italy, where he ran into a fellow he knew in the service, and who told him about the fact that he could go to school on the GI Bill. And so he decided he would enroll in the university there, and he did. And he had some really incredible experiences during his time in Europe that I've gone into great detail in the book. And a lot of it has to do with the Jefferson life, or the Alexander life, kind of poking itself out, and him having some flashbacks, or people relating to him on a subconscious level about who he had been in the past. So really, he never had, he had a variety of jobs through the years. In retail, he was a DJ at one point. He was in a jazz band at another point. He was writing ads for radio, so commercial writing, and nothing at all that had to do with anything about spirituality or about the Cayce legacy. And his dream always was, to work at the ARE, but that just never happened. His last job before he retired, he was roasting coffee beans at a local coffee business here in Charlottesville. So, he ended up staying home and being a house husband. He was married several times. He has children from various marriages. And really, that's about it. There's not much that he can point to that would say, I made this big contribution here or there, or, he tried to go to law school because he knew Jefferson had been a lawyer, and that didn't work out. He is a talented artist, but he didn't pursue that either. So, he had a lot of starts and stops throughout his life. But
would he have flashes of memories of his past lives at all?
Yeah, I asked him once, I said, do you believe you were Thomas Jefferson because you have memories, or because Edgar Cayce said you were? And he said it was because Cayce said he had been Jefferson. But that isn't totally true, because there are stories he tells in which he did have flashes. For instance, when he was a freshman in high school, he was not a very good student. He did not do well in school. And part of it was because he was moved around so much. He didn't stay in any school any length of time. And the other part of it was that he thought that the things that the teachers were teaching were ridiculous. They weren't that important compared to what he thought was important. And so when he was in high school, freshman, he had his final history exam, and he read the questions. He realized, I can't answer any of these questions. And so he said, well, I knew I had to write something because I needed to get promoted. I didn't want to be kept behind, and my teachers were already warning me that was what was going to happen. So he said he reached out to the universe, and he did what I call soul writing. So he reached out to the universe, and like opened himself up and then sat and wrote out word for word the Declaration of Independence and the Statute for Religious Freedom in Virginia. And then he said, and I signed John Adams' name and a couple of other names of the guys that I really liked back then. And I went up to the teacher and I said, here, this is all I know about history. You can fail me or you can pass me. Well, she looked down at this and she thought he was being ridiculous. They ended up suspending him while they looked into it. And they knew he couldn't have cheated because he was sitting right in front of the teacher. So they had no choice but to pass him and promote him to the next grade. But that's an example, one of many, in which that the memories started to flood through. And then people around him, he actually recited part of the Declaration of Independence to Edgar Cayce when TJ was only like 2 years old. And Cayce wrote that in a letter to somebody. He goes, yeah, he says he's convinced he's Thomas Jefferson. And then Cayce was convinced of it himself. So, all through the book, you'll read little stories here and there of how those lifetimes bled through into this lifetime.
That's got to be tough. And would he have other elements of memories come to him from other lifetimes, since he was already tapped into that and kind of educated? And how do you separate where the knowledge is coming from, do you think? And I'm asking this not necessarily for you to put the words in his mouth, but working in this field and understanding hypnotherapy and regression, how do we separate which lifetime we're actually connecting with and these memories might be coming from?
Well, I think, obviously in the case of Jefferson, it's easy to identify if it's a Jefferson memory since it's, documents that Jefferson wrote. But also recognizing people. When he went to Greece, the way he got to Greece was funny because he and his friends in Virginia Beach, all summer, they would find ways to make money off of tourists. And then at the end of the summer, they would pool their money and then they would buy tickets to different places. And then they'd go and pull out a ticket out of a hat. And TJ pulled one for Luxembourg. And he said he flew there and he said he looked around and he thought, I don't know anything about Luxembourg. And he's looking at the marquee to see if he could fly someplace else. And this young man who was a student at NYU came up to him and said, you can't read that, can you? You don't understand the language. He said, no. And the kid said, why don't you come home with me? Come to Greece with me. My father's the mayor and you could stay with us. And that's what he did. Well, as it turned out, the house that mayor was living in and this young man was living in was once owned by Aristotle. And Aristotle had been Alexander's teacher. And so the Alexander life started to come into play. And then TJ later said that young man, he recognized him as having been Hephaestion. Hephaestion was Alexander's best friend. And so he recognized him. And TJ now will occasionally say that he recognizes somebody that had been with him in one of those lifetimes, or he'll deny, that somebody was who they think they were in that lifetime with him. So he has that sort of ability, to do that. He learned a lot from Cayce, but, he had an affinity for language, especially Japanese. He just absolutely loved Japan. So that begs the question, did he have a past life in Japan? And ironically, this book is really wildly popular in Japan. There's a whole Cayce group out there, and they've been in touch with me wanting to get in touch with him because he so loved Japan, and he that's in the book what he said. So, there's all kinds of bleed through that come in and out of our lives, everybody's life, deja vu experiences, things like that that'll point you in the direction of a past life if you are so inclined to be open to seeing it from that perspective.
In re-examining this life, how open was he in talking to you about the things that had gone on and the expectations and his experiences?
I think that he was hesitant, and he admitted this to me because the very first day that I met him, I was invited to his home for dinner. His wife invited me to dinner. They did not know that I knew who he was. And I was looking for a way to say that. And so all through the first part of the dinner, he didn't say anything. And then all of a sudden, he said, well, Mr. Cayce said I was Thomas Jefferson. I mean, he was kind of like, mumbling it so that I didn't say anything. I didn't react. And I didn't go, oh, Mr. Jefferson, I'm so glad to meet you. And so that's how he was. He was very cautious about it. And I had to really convince him to come out and do those programs. And at first, because he said to people, he says, when I mentioned I was Thomas Jefferson or Alexander, he says, I just kind of wait for the laughter to die down in the room. And when the people who came to the programs that I organized for him didn't laugh, and I said to him, you see, you're surrounded by people who love and accept you. And then he felt much more confident. And then the charisma would just ooze out of him, and people were attracted to him. It was like a bunch of groupies around a rock star. He just pulled people in toward him, and they hung on his every word. That's how compelling he is when you're talking to him. And so, so he kept it pretty quiet for many, many years, and and now it's all out there. So. But he lives like a recluse. He lives up on a mountain that's, if he goes to the top of where he lives and he gets binoculars, he can actually see Monticello, which is Jefferson's home. So at first I used to really irritate him because, he felt like he was living in poverty, and here all these people were swarming through his old home.
Right.
He has said things like when he first went to Monticello many, many, many years ago alone, he was waiting to go on the tour, and the docent said, well, what's your name? And he said, well, it's Thomas Jefferson. He doesn't add the Davis. He just said it was Thomas Jefferson. And she said, oh, are you related? And he said, well, kind of in an indirect way. And she said, well, then, you could go up to the dome room. You can go into rooms that are not open to the public. And he said, no, that's okay, And then another time he went to Monticello. Every year at the 4th of July, they have a naturalization ceremony there. And so he said, I wanted to see something good that, although Jefferson had nothing to do with that, but he wanted to go up to Monticello to see this. And when he got there, the parking lot was full, and he told the attendant, he says, well, you don't understand, I'm Thomas Jefferson, this is my house. And the attendant said, well, I'm sorry, Mr. Jefferson, there's no place for you to park, you'll have to leave. So those are some of the stories that are in the book that I found very amusing and made him very human.
What are some of his fondest memories of working with Edgar?
Oh, the time they spent on the pier fishing. He said that, and in the garden, the Cayces had a big garden, and he worked there, and he said that's where he first saw fairies. He was only two and a half, and it scared him so much he just hightailed it out of there and ran in the house and tried to explain what he saw. And Mr. Cayce, oh, those are just fairies. Just go out there and you could play with them. So he would see fairies. He saw Mr. Cayce levitate somebody. He used to complain to Mr. Cayce that he was lonely. He was the only little kid out there. And so one day he was out on the pier, and he heard a violin playing, and he turned around, and it was a little girl his age, and she was playing the violin. And Mr. Cayce said, "Here, go play with her for a while." And TJ said that she only spoke Italian, and he described her as gossamer. He said when she would really get into playing the music, he said, I could put my hand right through her. He said, but I still thought she was a neighbor child. And so she was a constant in his life until Mr. Cayce died. And then when he ended up going to Italy and he was in Perugia and he was looking for a place to live, he went into the home of a woman who had a room for rent. And while she was making coffee, he looked at all the pictures on her piano, and lo and behold, there was a picture of little Stefanella with her violin. And he thought, should I say something to this woman that I know this little girl? And he said, how am I going to explain it? They're very Catholic here in Italy. They're not going to take too lightly to this story. But he did tell her. And turns out that little Stefanella, that same little girl that he saw on the pier when he was a little boy was this woman's, either her mother or her grandmother. He didn't remember. So, so it sort of came full circle. So he has a lot of stories like that. He heard Mr. Cayce was doing a reading, and Michael the Archangel came through Cayce. This is actually in the readings, and he said the whole house shook. So he just has, like I said, like one story after the other, and then of course the time they spent together. They would go to the movies together. They would go on scavenger hunts on the beach, and all of those were very fond memories for him. But I think the time they spent alone on the pier, he said I was just in awe of this man. He said I could ask him any question and he'd answer it for me. And he said not many children get an education like I did. So he has nothing but fond memories of the time they spent together.
That's awesome. Now, through TJ's life, did he have other experiences with the supernatural? I mean, I know you said the fairies and some of the other aspects, but I'm just wondering if, kind of having been magnetized to this through Edgar Cayce's workings, teachings, and just being around him, what was his life in the paranormal?
He doesn't talk too much about that. He did talk about once that he was visited when he was a teenager. He was living with Gladys. And he said that some light orb came into the room and came right through the wall. And he had some feathers in a vase, and, they disrupted the feathers and they were all over the place. That's one of the times that he had an encounter. But I don't recall him talking at all about any other kinds of encounters of the extraordinary kind. He may have, but he hasn't talked about it.
If he made a soul contract to kind of come back and had these things in mind, I understand we still have free will, but how hard is it to break those soul contracts, to shift the dynamic of what we originally set about to come here to do and end up on a completely, juxtaposition kind of track?
It's not hard at all. I mean, we all do it. One of the main question that people ask me when they come to me for a regression is, I don't know why I'm here. I want to know what my purpose is. And so we go into the life between life session that I do with them, and they find out what it is. Up until that point, had they been on that path? Probably not. Do they go on the path once they know about it? Many of them do. We have built-in resistance to doing what we're supposed to do because it might be a challenge for us. We don't have the support system around us, and we don't feel like we could do that on our own. But, you can alter the pattern anytime. By the same token, you can turn it around and look at it the other way and say, nothing is random. Everything has a purpose, and wherever you are now is exactly where you are supposed to be. So who's to say? But that's why I don't know that it was in his favor for Cayce to give him that reading. And I've talked to him about that. I said, do you think children should be given a reading? Because you have to remember, too, because his reading was so huge, everybody made a big deal out of it. Everybody in Virginia Beach knew who he had been in a previous lifetime. And so they're kind of hovering around him, waiting for him to do something, and that was very difficult for him. He didn't know that life elsewhere. When he tried to make friends, when he would see the way they lived, the way he lived, he realized they were two completely different worlds. And it was very hard for him, and then on top of that, Gladys would read him his life reading every night, like it's storybook time, So instead of reading about Winnie the Pooh, he was hearing about how he had been in Atlantis. He was, part of the dark side that was responsible for the destruction of Atlantis. But at the last minute, he changed his mind and he became part of the Law of One and ended up bringing groups of people and colonizing different parts of the world. And so, what do you do with that information? And you hear that when you're a child. What are the expectations on you? And I think while he was with the Cayces, he certainly felt like anything was possible. He just had to look at Mr. Cayce to know that. But then afterwards, it was a totally different thing.
When you have this life unfulfilled, this destiny that's kind of non-followed, you said it's easy to change over and not follow those patterns. How do we know that, Edgar was tapping in on who he was, on what the potential of somebody with that knowledge and soul history could be. But that was never his intention. Maybe his intention was he's lived the life of Alexander the Great and Thomas Jefferson, two men under the scrutiny of people constantly, measured constantly through history, measured and weighed. Maybe he came back to this life to be nomadic, to be this hermit, to get peace in one lifetime that wasn't like that. How do we know that breaking the soul contract wasn't him trying to become this thing, this being that Edgar Cayce saw he had potential to become? Maybe the breaking the soul contract would have been to take that path as opposed to following the path of quiet and solitude and separation that he had in this lifetime.
Right. Well, yeah, that's always a possibility. And when I think about him now, and I've said this to him, I said, the thing that people don't understand about reincarnation is that it is not a steady upward trajectory. In other words, you have a really great life. The next one's going to be greater than that. And the one after that, greater than that. You go up and down. Like Cayce always said, in that life, the soul gained, or in that life, the soul lost. Cayce himself had been Rata, an Egyptian priestess, and a priest rather. And he then he had another life in which he was a riverboat gambler named Bainbridge. So you can go from greatness and topple down to mediocrity, not on a soul level, mind you, because on a soul level we're all equal and the same. But in terms of accomplishments or what your people are viewing you as on Earth. Now, in this life, I will tell you that TJ is dealing with a lot of karma from the Jefferson lifetime. He's living in poverty, pretty much has a hard time making ends meet. Jefferson died in bankruptcy, so he hasn't learned how to use money any more than Jefferson did, on a whole different scale, obviously. But he's a gardener, and Jefferson like a master gardener, and he's pursuing that. It has pursued that in this life. He lives a very quiet, peaceful life. I never hear him complain at all. I would complain if I had the life that he's living now, but it's all about balance. So if you go too far to the left in one life, and then you go too far to the right, you're going to have to come in the center. And if you've had a really great life that drained the energy out of you, you might come back to Earth just to enjoy being on the Earth, a little bit of a vacation, a respite life. Like when people come to me and they have regressions, sometimes they get a very beautiful, happy, peaceful lifetime. And it's usually sandwiched in between two lives that were anything but. So you get a little bit of a respite between times. So that's very well what could be going on here while he's working on some karma. I know he has said to me repeatedly that one of the karmic, one of the aspects of Jefferson's life that bothers him the most is the issue of slavery. And so that's on his mind a lot. And he actually said that he was the first white young man in the Virginia Beach area to join the NAACP. I think that was back in I don't know when that was. It was pretty early on. And so he said he can get along with anybody in any part of the world. He has that ability to be a diplomat again, which, would have been ideal for working on that, that prophecy about doing for the world what Jefferson did for this country. He got that because of his world travel. So there's a lot of bleed through. There's a lot of crossover going on. I believe you live the life that that you're supposed to live. Like I said, and Cayce says this too, nothing is random. You pick your parents, you pick, your soul family comes in to assist you. You get your memory triggers. You pick out the body that you have. All of that is done in the between life time when you're in the afterlife before you become you're conceived and become incarnate again. So one could say that he's living the life exactly that he was supposed to live. But that's something that only he knows.
You've been doing this for how long with regressions and working in that field?
34 years.
When you're sending Dave Schrader, host of Darkness Radio, into a regression, mm-hmm. Hypnosis helps to, it doesn't make you, crawl like a chicken or snort like a pig. It relaxes you. It releases some of your internal walls and lets forth the creative juices. How do we know that when I'm having an experience that it is not a fragment of this lifetime that I've buried and choose to look at it through a different lens? We know that people have those disenfranchised moments in their life when they're abused or they're confused or sick, and they compartmentalize those pieces of themselves. And what they're reviewing isn't necessarily a past life, but maybe something in this life that traumatized them, that they've pushed out, and they're re-examining it as though it was something apart from them.
Well, if you consider the script that we follow, I use a very lengthy relaxation process for people so that their subconscious comes forward, their conscious mind sort of goes to sleep. And then I ask the soul to bring forward the lifetime that's most impacting them today. So we narrow it down that way. And then, after the very long induction, the relaxation process, I get them to that feeling like you have when you first wake up in the morning. Your eyes are closed and you feel, you know where you are. You can hear things around you, but you just don't want to get up because you're so comfortable. That's the goal of the physical feeling I like them to have. Then I start to, take them. I ask the soul to show them the lifetime that's most impacting them now. And, we start with identification questions to find out what they look like. And the color of their hair, the color of their skin, if they're male or female, where are they in the world? What is the year? What's their name? And then we go to the significant event. And so I'll say, have your soul scan that life and tell me the one significant event that happened that was it was so important that it got recorded as unfinished business on your soul. And that's when they start to tell me the story of that lifetime. If there's emotion involved, if they begin to cry, then it's a good sign that that's a real memory. That is something, because I can't make them cry in hypnosis. Like you said, it's not like I could say, okay, start barking like a dog and they'll do it. No, you won't do anything in hypnosis that you wouldn't do in a waking state. So they have that security. They know that that whatever they're coming up with is real. They go through that significant event until there's nothing left to tell me. Then we go into the death scene and they recount their death. They say how old they were at the time, what they died from, whether they were alone, and then, what does it feel like to die? And they explain that. And what does the afterlife look like? And what's your journey from the physical body to being in spirit? So there's a lot of safeguards within a organized regression that would ensure that a past life memory is coming up, not something from the current life.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, you talk about taking them through death. What do most people describe death feeling like, or what is that experience like?
Well, my last book before this, the one we're talking about today, was I Did It to Myself, and that was about case studies of the near death of the life between life soul contract. And I asked that question, what does it feel like to die? One of the reasons I asked it is because I wanted to give some assurance to people who were so concerned about death and afraid of death that it really wasn't anything to be afraid of. And sure enough, every single person, I had 25 people in that research project, and they all said the same thing, that it was a very pleasant experience, that they felt free, they felt relief, that they just floated out of the body. They were glad to leave the body behind. And they described leaving the body, then getting to the afterlife and finding their spirit home. That's their home base while they're in spirit, and working on the things that they need to work on in the afterlife before they can come back. Picking out, meeting with the Council of Elders, picking out the curriculum, so to speak, for this life, the issues that you're going to be working on. So it was a surprisingly across the board pleasant experience. They say it's a lot more pleasant than being born. And that amazed me, because I expected at least one person to come and say, oh, it's awful. Even the people who had a traumatic death. I had several who were tortured to death. And they said that their soul actually left that physical body before death occurred. So they didn't feel the torture. I had one woman who was whipped, a man who had been a woman in a previous life, and she'd been whipped to death, and said that the soul left before that death took place, which I had heard before. I had even heard that in Joan of Arc. Yeah. So anyway, it seemed to be not at all as difficult and traumatic as we've been led to believe.
The lives between lives.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a time parameter? Do we know that, we spend 100 Earth years between life? Do we spend a flash? Can I die today and be reborn tomorrow if I choose? What can you tell us about that span of time between death and life again?
Well, most of the studies that I have read have indicated that the average between life period time is between 50 and 200 years. Because there's no time in spirit. So to them, it's a blink of an eye. For us, it's 50 to 200 years. If you commit suicide, if you are murdered, if you leave prematurely, you come back immediately. So, because it's like, if you think of Earth as a school and the things you're working on are all your classes, the lessons that you signed up for, if you leave prematurely, it's like dropping out of school, right? So you have to repeat that grade. So that's what it's akin to. So, that's in that case, I remember right after the Vietnam War, maybe 20 years later, there was this resurgence in the popularity of tie-dye shirts and bell-bottom slacks and music from the 60s. And that was, I've been told, the resurgence of all the young men and women who perished in that war. Their lives were ended prematurely, and they sort of came back as a group, soul group, and they still had an interest in what they had left behind in the 60s. So I found that really a fascinating idea.
Do you ever encounter people that between lives were in hell?
No.
Because we haven't fully died yet? Is that why? Because there's that, we go from one existence to another? Or do some of us have to go through a heaven experience, a hell experience first?
Well, I've never had anybody say that there was a hell. Nobody's talked about hell. They don't talk about heaven. They don't talk about hell. They don't talk about purgatory. We're going to a place of non-judgment, of compassionate understanding and love, unconditional love. So the soul just goes back to spirit, reviews the previous lifetime, sees where it went wrong, or sees what lessons it still needs to learn, designs the next life to deal with those lessons, and then comes back. Now, in terms of karma, you've got some people who are having a lifetime that's fraught with difficulty. They may be dealing with a chronic illness. They may be abused, abandoned, all sorts of things. All of those are tied to something that may have happened in a prior lifetime, and it may be just balancing itself out. So in other words, if you're dealing with abandonment now, chances are you abandoned somebody in a previous life. If you're dealing with obesity now, could have been that you made fun of someone who was obese in a previous life. It could be an attitude issue, or you could have starved to death in a previous life, and now you just can't get enough food. So it's a balance. It's a reap what you sow kind of thing. Cause and effect is what karma really is. So anyway, everyone talks about going to the same place. Everyone in my research project described the afterlife nearly the same way. The only, they talked about this council of elders that they met with, but they're the equivalent of like guidance counselors at school, planning out your curriculum. So, but nobody talked about being banished or being sent to a penal colony, so to speak. That just did not happen.
Are there tools that you could help us with to tap into our past lives, to gain knowledge, gain wisdom, gain insights from those past lives, something that we could do today from home?
Yeah, just if you meditate, if I don't know how many of your listeners meditate on a regular basis, but if you go into a meditative state, and you can do what I call soul writing. I teach that as well, and I've written about it. Soul writing is a written form of meditation. In my second book, Your Soul Remembers, I talk about how you can use soul writing to access past life information. So it's going into this meditative state and asking the question of spirit that you want answered. What can you tell me about my most significant past life? Or I'm having this issue with my sister. Is it karmically related? Or any number of questions that you can pose to spirit. It's like a 24/7 hotline. And you can get answers to any questions that you pose. So that would be a way of doing it on your own. There's also the resonance method of past life recall, where you can play detective and start to look at different aspects of your current life to get hints about your past life. So make a list of the things that you're drawn to in this life. What kind of music do you like? Art, culture, foods, language, places that you visit. I also teach that as well. And then, of course, the best way is through a past life regression. And I have all those listed on my website, by the way, which is JoanneDiMaggio.com. So if anybody was interested in the different types of ways that you can access past life information, that's all listed there. And, I'm doing the sessions via Zoom. So if anybody wants a session with me, they can book it.
We have Joanne's link on today's program as well. So we've got a link for her book. We've got a link for her website, so it's easier to connect with her and get that done. Fascinating stuff. I'm still on the fence post of what I believe with reincarnation and what I don't. I've had recurring dreams, Joanne, of myself. But when I look in the mirror, I'm well aware that who I'm looking at is not me now. It's a different version of me.
Right.
Am I getting a glimpse at a past life? Am I getting a glimpse at an alternate reality, multiverse version of myself? How do I know? I mean, to me, I believe it's a past life. It looks like if the 50s, the clothing, the hair, the car I'm driving. So to me, it feels like a past life, but I can't connect with it more than these fleeting dreams. These dreams stand out to me, and I call them sequel dreams, because they may pick up. I may have a dream tonight about it, not have another dream for 5 years, but when I pick up that dream, it seems to pick up right where I left off 5 years prior. And I'm given these glimpses. Yeah,
I mean, dreams are a really good way of getting past life information. And if you can have a lucid dream, or if you can, maybe meditate on, I'd like to get a dream about my past life tonight. You can. Many times if you're watching a movie, there'll be certain aspects of that film that will remind you of something or feel very familiar to you. So that's a way of doing it. When I was a kid, my aunt and uncle lived next door to us, and I used to look out the window down into their basement, and I'd see them down there, and I kept having this thought that they would look completely different if I turned away. I think that's what I grew up thinking, that people had this alternate appearance. I didn't know too much about the soul back then, because like I said, I grew up Catholic and we really didn't talk about it in those terms. But I really think that that you could get a glimpse. And then other people, if they recognize you, I've had people come up to me and say, "Oh, you can't deny who you were because I remember you." You know how Shakespeare said the eyes are the windows to the soul? I think that's true. The eyes are the one part of us that doesn't change from one life to the other. So there's various ways you can recognize. I mean, I had a friend of mine that I knew in my 18th century life, and she's female in this life, but was male in that life, and walked the same, held the glass of wine in the exact same way that he did back then. And it was fascinating, the cadence of their speech. So many hints are out there if you just, open your mind to them and allow them to come in. Because they're there. They're right at the surface. They've always been there. You just need to, have an open mind to retrieve them and to apply them to the here and now.
I appreciate the insight on this fascinating book, fascinating time, and a way to look into this life that ties Thomas Jefferson, Alexander the Great, and Edgar Cayce together, and what it's like to live this life. Just in closing, does TJ feel unfulfilled by the life he's led this time around? Is it filled with resentment that he didn't achieve what Cayce saw as his potential? Or is he comforted in the fact that he led the life he chose as opposed to the life that was being told to him that he was supposed to live?
No, I think he very much feels that he didn't fulfill the destiny that Cayce laid out for him. And I think it's been a source of much sorrow for him, much frustration for him. But I think also that he hasn't taken the responsibility to try to turn it around on his own. I think he's always been looking for someone else, to figure this out for him. And I've told him, I said, well, maybe this book is the way it's going to turn around. You'll reach a global audience with it. And maybe by doing so, you'll change the hearts and souls of people. It will reach them on some other level. And therefore, you will have fulfilled that prophecy. You're still alive. You're still breathing. And as long as there's life in you, you can still make that contribution. So I'm hoping that we're on course to turn that around so that when he does finally leave this life, he can have a sigh of relief that, in fact, he pulled it off maybe at the last minute, but he pulled it off nonetheless.
Fascinating stuff. The book link is up in today's program. Joanne's website is up in today's program guide. Please keep in touch with us, Joanne. I'm fascinated by this and would love to know where your research and studies take you next.
Okay. Thanks so much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you.
Certainly. Are there any other projects or things you'd like to mention for people to keep an eye out for?
Well, I'm actually going in a different direction with my next book. It's going to be on the Beatles and spirituality. I'm going to take a look at whether the Beatles planted the seed of spirituality in my generation, and that it came to fruition maybe 30 years later for those of us that have chosen an esoteric career line. So I was actually president of a Beatles fan club when I was a teenager. I'll show you how old I am. And I have all my newsletters from back then. So I've been pouring through those and pulling out information. And I've got about 45 Beatle biographies to go through. So I think that's going to be a fun project for me this time. And I'm looking forward to seeing where it leads.
Very cool. Well, as a fan of the Beatles and spirituality, let us know when the book comes out. I'm sure our listeners would be fascinated to hear about that as well.
Okay, thank you so much. I will.
Thank you, Joanne DiMaggio. That's it for today's show, folks. Remember, tomorrow we're back with Holzer's Ghosts as we look into ancient evil, the haunting of America's Stonehenge, Mystery Hill. the live video stream tonight on my Facebook page and Darkness Radio YouTube page. So watch along, have some fun. Tune in tomorrow and hear the full audio podcast of that episode. We have special guests Alexandra Holzer, Scott Walter, and Dennis Stone that will be with us. And then we're back again with you next week with more of the best in paranormal talk radio. For Tim Dennis, I'm Dave Schrader. You've been listening to Darkness Radio.